All right, and without further ado, how and why to update your floodplain ordinance. So today we're talking about really the backbone of your floodplain management program in your community. Whether you be a county, a village, or a city, your community, if you participate in the National Flood Insurance Program, is required to have a floodplain management ordinance that establishes your minimum standards in your community for floodplain development. This ordinance is something that we will always refer you to whenever someone asks us a question about how to permit a type of development. We typically pull up your floodplain ordinance, and that's where we're going to pull a lot of our answers from. Now, obviously, we have a bit more in-depth understanding of what those regulations might mean, but that's where we're really going to be pulling from. And so having an up-to-date floodplain ordinance will make your job as a floodplain administrator that much easier, and our job that much easier when we're answering your questions. So this is a really important class to attend today, if not one of the more important classes that you can attend. Starting with the basics, we'll talk about why we're going to pass a new ordinance. So there's a few different reasons, and one of them isn't listed here, but I'll go into that. It's only the one time. So to adopt new panels. So for those of you that aren't sure what I'm talking about when I say panels, I'm referring to the flood insurance rate map panels. So flood insurance rate maps are the maps that show your floodplain in your jurisdiction. And we're calling them panels because we map the floodplain and then they're divided into sort of rectangular panels that have ID numbers with each of them. When your community undergoes a new mapping project, whether you be a county or a city or whatever you may be within this mapping project, you're going to receive new flood insurance rate map panels with new identification numbers. So when that project nears completion, we reach out to you and let you know that it's time to adopt those new panel IDs. They are listed in your floodplain ordinance under the lands to which your jurisdiction applies. So in the model ordinance, the state template that we have on our website, that would be section 2.1. But this paragraph, lands to which jurisdiction applies, this paragraph establishes the floodplain maps that your community is going to use to regulate within. To make your ordinance easier to use. So with any ordinance, the hardest part is trying to interpret what it's saying. We have developed our model ordinance to be relatively as straightforward as it can be. So it walks you through not only what the regulations are for different types of development, but also the administrative processes that have to take place anytime you receive a permit in your office. Also establishes variance procedures, enforcement procedures, and has a list of definitions that are kept up to date. So really what the model ordinance is designed to do is just make the ordinance as easy as possible to interpret. So passing a new ordinance allows you to update your verbiage, update your language, and the structure of the ordinance itself to allow for easier interpretation. To ensure it meets FEMA and state minimum standards, so what this is referring to is your community, to be a participant in the National Flood Insurance Program, you have to have an ordinance that meets or exceeds FEMA's minimum standards as well as Nebraska's minimum standards, because here in Nebraska we do have some higher standards than what FEMA enforces. So you have to make sure that your ordinance is going to meet or exceed state minimum standards. Old ordinances may not necessarily do that. Things change, standards change. And when that happens, the ordinance has to be updated to make sure that it meets those minimum standards. So for those of you with ordinances that are more than, I believe, around 20 or 30 years old, we'll go with that just as a general number, then you would probably need to contact us and ask about updating your ordinance to make sure you're meeting minimum standards. It's also easier than fixing or finding your old ordinance. So for those of you with ordinances that are out of date, you can amend the ordinance to correct any deficiencies, but that can get quite complicated when you're pulling and fixing certain sections of your ordinance without changing the whole ordinance. It can get quite complicated, and keeping track of those amendments can be quite difficult. So we will always recommend just passing a new ordinance and starting from scratch. And again, if you don't have a current ordinance, that's not a problem. Just reach out to us and we can get started on the process of adopting a new ordinance. And using a standard ordinance, right? So this is just re-explaining what I was talking about earlier. You're using a standardized ordinance. Our model ordinance is built to meet state and federal minimum standards already. So by using our standardized model ordinance, it ensures that you're not going to miss anything, that you are getting all of the information that you need into that ordinance without having to go through multiple reviews. It just makes things a lot easier in terms of getting that ordinance to a point where it meets state minimum standards. And there is a link that Michelle put in the chat to find our model ordinance page. This will take you to the 4 different versions of the model ordinance. We'll talk about what each version of ordinance means and which one you should use. An ordinance update will be required if the ordinance is determined to be out of compliance with current NFIP or state regulations. So we determine that typically through the auditing process. Auditing process for us means a CAC, a Community Assistance Contact, or a CAV, Community Assistance Visit. The difference between the two is that a CAC is a more informal visit or contact with your community just to verify that your program is being run correctly, that you're administering your ordinance, and that everything is good to go. A CAV is a much more in-depth look at your administrative processes and typically involves some site review. But during both of these, we will review your floodplain ordinance to see if it's in compliance or if things need to be updated. So again, if your community is receiving new flood insurance rate maps or a new flood insurance study, so if you're part of a new floodplain mapping project, then you will be required to update your floodplain ordinance to adopt those new flood insurance rate maps or flood insurance study. You have to reference it in your ordinance and make sure that you're not referencing the old one. Now, we'll be in contact with you when that happens. You don't have to try and keep track. There are multiple windows at which we will be involved with your community to make sure that that is being done and that it's being done on time. You have to make sure that you adopt the ordinance prior to those maps becoming effective. If you don't do so, then your community could be at risk of being removed from the National Flood Insurance Program, even if it's just temporary. If your community jurisdictional boundaries change. So what I mean by this is if your community is expanding your jurisdiction, it's very possible that you might expand into another flood insurance rate map panel. So say, for example, you adopt your floodplain ordinance in 2010, and you adopt 4 flood insurance rate maps that impact your community. And then this year, you decide to annex and expand your community's boundaries to the west, and you accidentally expand your jurisdiction into another flood insurance rate map panel. That new panel will need to be referenced in your ordinance, so make sure to be aware of that. And again, if federal or state minimum standards change, this doesn't happen very commonly. However, I put this in here because there are some discussions about updating Nebraska's minimum standards in the near future. Nothing quite confirmed in concrete quite yet, but that's just a conversation that we're having. If that were to occur, we would be requiring ordinance updates for every participating community. And I'm sure that this question was in everybody's head, but the communities with active mapping projects are being shown on the screen right now. These are mapping projects that are actually approaching completion. Now, I say approaching completion, I don't necessarily mean in a month or in 6 months even. I mean a year or 2 before the maps will go effective. However, it's important to know and be ready for this. There is a 6-month window. It's called a letter of final determination. That starts a 6-month period for your county or your community to adopt those flood insurance rate map panels within. So we will be in contact with you at that point, at the very least, to make sure that that's happening. You don't necessarily need to be contacting us unless you'd like to get that process If you are in a community in any of these counties, though, be aware that you are involved in a mapping project that is approaching completion, so just be aware that we'll be in contact with you in the near future. Now, if we find that your ordinance is currently compliant, all we would recommend is that the ordinance be amended to adopt the new panels and correct the paragraphs that need to be corrected. If your ordinance is not in compliance, we would recommend the route of adopting a brand new ordinance. But again, that's all part of that review process when we reach out to you. Okay, let's go over the process with us. So this is how, anytime your community wants to update your floodplain ordinance, this is the process that needs to be followed. And I'm going to go one by one here. It's going to drop down some bullets to give you some more information. It's going to start with the board agreeing on an ordinance draft. So of course, you as the floodplain administrator have the authority to write up a floodplain ordinance, work with us to get a first draft. But at the end of the day, your community should be on board with what is going into that floodplain ordinance. So we always will recommend that you take that initial draft before your board and just have them agree on the content that's in that ordinance. Don't adopt the ordinance, just have them take a look at it and see if it makes sense, everything that's being included. At this time, we will recommend that you review any of the optional language. At the end of this class, I am going to open up our model ordinance and I'm going to go through some of that optional language that you can choose from. But there is optional language that your community can choose to keep or remove depending on what works best. At this point, you would also want to assign the floodplain administrator position. And note that it says position. You want to assign the floodplain administrator role to a position within your government, within your community, to make sure that it can carry on should somebody leave or someone change assignments, that there's always someone in that position. If you name your floodplain administrator by name, when that person leaves, it wouldn't automatically carry over. So make sure to just identify the position. Once you've got a draft and your community agrees on what's included in that draft, submit that draft to us. And you can just send it to us in an email. There's not necessarily a formal process for it. Just send the draft in an email to us. We estimate for about 10 working days. It's usually much shorter than that. But give us about 10 working days. We'll do a review of that ordinance to make sure it meets state standards. We do check some of the federal minimum standards, but our objective is to make sure that it meets state standards at that point. We have a list of requirements that need to be in that ordinance. We'll go through it. We also review the entire ordinance to make sure that there aren't any typos or formatting issues. We'll do all of this. If there are major concerns, we will provide comments back to you to make sure that things can be corrected. We won't necessarily make those changes for you. If we do, we'll make sure to point out which things were changed or which suggestions were made, but we'll send that draft back to you for comments to make sure that you have the ability to make changes. So if there's incorrect firm panels referenced, missing definitions, we'll add those as comments and we'll send back the ordinance for you to make corrections. Once we have a draft that passes our review, we're going to forward that to FEMA for final approval. So again, we're looking at the state minimum standards, and then we send it to FEMA to make sure it meets FEMA's minimum standards. It also acts as another cross-check. So it's another opportunity to check for more typos, check for any issues, just to double check our work and make sure that everything is okay. For the most part, this process is pretty quick because we've already done our review on our end. And typically, if an ordinance meets state minimum standards, it's probably going to meet FEMA's minimum standards because we have more than what FEMA requires. Again, estimate for about 10 working days. We will handle the coordination with FEMA. You don't need to worry about it. So we will take care of sending the ordinance to FEMA and compiling comments and sending them back to you. Once you have an approved draft from both NeDNR and FEMA, we'll notify you that you have been given approval for adoption. All that we request at that point is that you send a final signed and stamped copy of the adopted ordinance to us so that we can update our records and show that you're in compliance. For those of you who are concerned about adopting new flood insurance rate map panels, remember that there's an effective date on those panels, and you have to adopt them prior to that date. Unfortunately, even if you adopt the ordinance, if we don't see a copy of that adopted ordinance, we have no record that those panels were adopted. So you need to make sure not only do you adopt the ordinance prior to those firms becoming effective, but then that you also send us a copy of that signed and stamped ordinance when you're done. Very good. Let's see, any questions? Our ordinance was in 2007, so need to adopt new. And that's okay. Yeah, we can take a look at it. If you want to reach out to us, or after this, there's a survey. If you want to answer that survey and let us know that we need to contact you, either way, if you don't hear from us, you can reach out to us, but we'll help you adopt a new ordinance, certainly. And that's exactly what this class is for. We'll go over that process. So do you send the draft to FEMA, or do we? Oh yeah, okay. So yes, we answered that one. We'll take care of that coordination. You don't need to worry about finding a FEMA contact. We'll take care of that. That's what we're here for, is to bridge that connection between you and FEMA. Okay. We'll have more time for questions moving forward, so I'll keep going here. I'm going to talk about how to enact ordinances and resolutions. I won't spend a ton of time on this. I'm sure some of you are very familiar with this process, but still good to include. This information was initially provided to us by the League of Nebraska Municipalities a couple of years ago when they helped present that version, so I just wanted to give credit where it was due. Okay, so there are differences between ordinances and resolutions, and of course it's not just by name. There's more differences in terms of how they are adopted and what exactly they are creating. Some communities choose to adopt resolutions, others choose to adopt ordinances. It's whatever works best for you. We won't necessarily dictate one way or the other. But there are differences in how they are treated in statute. So a resolution is going to create new policy. An ordinance is going to create municipal law. And so make sure to work with your legal counsels in your community to make sure you understand the differences between the two and decide what works best for your community. When it comes to introducing new ordinances, unless the City Council or Board of Trustees has specified other procedures, ordinances are introduced by members of the City Council or Village Board in one of the following ways. So of the two ways, either a City Council member or Village Board member will present it to a majority of members elected to the council or board. And then you're going to read aloud the substance of the ordinance and file a copy with the clerk for future consideration. So that's the first way. And of course, this is coming from Nebraska's Basic Code of Ordinances. So feel free, I think there's a link. Yes, Michelle put the link in the chat for that. So feel free to read that if you would like. I believe I found it on the Village of Ansley's website. So thank you, Ansley, for providing a link to that. That was the easiest one that I could find. So the other method is that the council member or board member will present the proposed ordinance to the clerk, and then the clerk will present it to the council or the board. So the same concept, just going through different methods. Either the individual board or council member can do it, or you submit it to the clerk. For those of you that are the floodplain administrator and are also the clerk, that's how you can handle it if you would so choose. It's whatever works best for your community. Okay, so resolutions are going to be introduced in the same way. So we're not necessarily going to change anything between ordinances and resolutions in terms of introducing them to the village board or city council. County board as well. This is something to pay attention to. This isn't necessarily built into our model ordinance, but this for cities or villages, you have to start the ordinance off by, be it ordained by the mayor and city council of the city, or be it ordained by the chairperson and board of trustees of the village. So this is, again, this is in the Code of Ordinances, if you have a different method, just let us know, but this is from the Code of Ordinances. This is how it says they need to begin, at least in terms of adoption. So this is in regards to reading and passage of ordinances and resolutions. All ordinances and resolutions require for their passage or adoption the concurrence of a majority of all members elected to the City Council or Village Board of Trustees. So this has to be a majority of your elected officials, not necessarily the majority of a quorum. So for example, you can have a quorum if you have 5 members of your council and 3 people attend, that's a quorum. You need the majority of all 5 members in order to agree on the passage or adoption. Ordinances of a general or permanent nature are read by title on 3 different occasions. Unless 3/4 of the City Council or Board of Trustees vote to suspend this requirement. So again, 3/4 of the entire Council or Board would need to vote to suspend that requirement. But yes, technically speaking, when you're adopting ordinances, they have to be read on 3 different occasions. Now, again, going back to those of you that are having new flood insurance rate map panels that you may have to adopt, this might get a little close to the deadline if you're having to read on 3 different occasions and you only meet once a month. So that's something to pay attention to. What is your timeline? When did you get that draft to us? How many months do you have before those maps become effective? And you may need to waive that requirement. If the requirement is suspended, the ordinance is read by title and then moved for final passage. Once the ordinance is adopted, it has to be published in some way. So you are typically going to have a 15-day period where the ordinance is going to be passed and then it has to be published in some public format. This can be in a legal newspaper. For those of you that your newspaper isn't very long, it would become a very long newspaper. But you can do that. You can publish the ordinance in a legal newspaper or in general circulation. So just talking about posting it somewhere in the community, giving it a copy of it to your residences, or just having it available in some form by publishing it in a book or pamphlet and having it available. In 2021, a new law was passed by the Urban Affairs Committee that does allow for the publication of ordinances in electronic form. Electronic form specifically means a website. So you can upload your ordinance to the website. Just keep in mind, it's not necessarily going to be a notification. If you upload the ordinance to the website, it won't act as a notification to people that a new ordinance has been passed. So you might put a blurb in your newspaper or in a utility bill or some sort, notifying people that a new ordinance has been uploaded to the website. And I believe that link is to that, that law that was passed. Yes, thank you. Real quick, I want to go over some of the powers of the community members. So for village board chairs, chairpersons are required to have the ordinances of the village printed and published for the information of the inhabitants and to carry out and ensure the ordinances are being used. Now, part of that doesn't necessarily mean that the chairperson needs to enforce the ordinance, rather just that they need to make sure somebody is assigned to that ordinance to make sure it's being carried out. For mayors, mayors can veto or sign ordinances and resolutions. So if the mayor approves of the ordinance, they sign off on it, and it can be adopted that way. If the mayor decides to veto it, it gets returned back to the city council within 7 days, and 2/3 of the city council can overrule the veto. If the mayor does not sign within 7 days, it simply becomes effective without their signature, but it's very important to make sure it does end up on your mayor's desk at some point. Okay, so once an ordinance is adopted, typically they go into effect 15 days after their passage. So again, this is another note to think about for communities adopting new floodplain maps. You want to make sure that the ordinance is effective by that effective firm date at the very latest. So make sure you give yourself plenty of wiggle room or adjust that effective date to make sure that they match up with the firm effective date. Emergency ordinances are allowed in cases of riot, impending danger, failure of a public utility, or any other emergency. These ordinances take effect upon the proclamation of the mayor or village board chair. So for counties, obviously we've been talking a lot about communities recently, but counties, they are allowed to regulate certain subjects by ordinance, and floodplain management is an example of one of those. The process of adopting ordinances is very similar to municipalities, where somebody will introduce the ordinance to the board, and then it is going through the same process of reading or waiving the 3 reading requirements. All of that is going to follow much the same process as what we talked before, just at the county level. There's information regarding county ordinances, and you can find that for revised statute 23187 to 23193. If you have specific questions about county level ordinances, you can contact the Nebraska Association of County Officials for more information. We've talked about why to update your ordinance, and we've talked about the process for updating an ordinance or adopting a new ordinance. But the hardest part is getting that initial draft. And what's the easiest way to do that? Well, we have a model, or in other words, a template floodplain ordinance that we provide that already has Nebraska's minimum standards built in. So our state regulations are going to be based on the federal minimum standards. So our state standards at least meet the Code of Federal Regulations 60.3. And there's no test on that. You don't need to remember those numbers. Just giving you the information that it starts at the federal level. We're following the regulations built into 60.3. And through Nebraska's minimum standards for floodplain management programs, we adopt at least FEMA's or the federal government's minimum standards. In fact, our minimum standards do go above and beyond the federal minimum standards for floodplain management. So this Title 455, Chapter 1 is going to be coming from the CFR. So we're using the CFR to build our regulations. And then your community, I don't have the slide for it, I'm sorry, but your community is then adopting an ordinance that at least meets state minimum standards, that at least meet Title 455. There are 3 model ordinances, and technically that's not true. There's technically 4, but I won't necessarily talk about one of those, and I'll explain why. The 3 different ordinances are going to be identified by B, C, and D, and this correlates to the level of regulation within the CFR 60.3. So 60.3B, that model ordinance is going to be for communities that only have basic A zones. So for those of you, if you've attended my beginner's guide to floodplain management or Chuck's basic floodplain administration class, you know that A zones are going to be those blue blobs of floodplain with not a lot of information on them that are called Zone A. You're going to use a B level ordinance. For those of you that have AE, AO, or AH floodplains, but you don't have a designated floodway, you will be using 60.3C. This is not a very common ordinance, but we do have a few communities that do use this. It's not many. Typically, when we're going through an enhanced study, we are also mapping a floodway. And finally, 60.3D, this is going to be for communities that have any of the above zones and an identified floodway. And this applies even if it's just a little bit. So if you just have a little tiny bit of floodway or a little tiny bit of AE zones, you step up to the next level of regulation, even though you don't have much to worry about in terms of regulating in that area, you still have to do it. And that's what I was saying earlier when we talked about if your community expands your jurisdiction. it could end up being that you accidentally move into an area that has a designated floodway where you didn't have one before. That automatically steps up the number of regulations that you need to adopt and could make your community non-compliant if you aren't sure that if you have not adopted that floodway language that's in a 60.3D ordinance. For this presentation, I'm going to open up the D ordinance because they build on top of each other. This is the best way to visualize that, but they build on top of each other. So everything in a 60.3D ordinance is also going to include everything that was in a 60.3A ordinance. So today I'm going to cover the D ordinance because it's going to have everything in it. I didn't talk about 60.3A. This is for communities that don't have identified flood insurance rate maps. Again, not very common to have a participating community that doesn't have any floodplain maps, but it is something that we have available. So there are technically 4 different types. And if you want to get even more technical, there's technically 5, although E applies to coastal communities, which we don't have here in Nebraska. So we don't have a Model E ordinance, just the A through D. What I'm going to do, I'm going to break down each section of our model ordinance, and I'm going to explain how it's structured, and then I'll open up the model ordinance and we'll kind of look at it and see what it actually looks like. So sections 1 through 2.7 is going to be your typical legal stuff that you see in any ordinance. So it has your authorization, statement of purpose, your interpretation, your warning and disclaimer of liability, and your severability sections. All of this is built into that first section 1 through 2.7. Now these numbers may not perfectly match up with your ordinance. Again, this is just using our model ordinance. So please understand that these numbers are just coming from our model ordinance. Specifically section 2.1, this is talking about lands to which the ordinance applies. And this is what I was talking about earlier, where you're adopting the flood insurance rate maps. So you have to reference the floodplain maps for your community by panel number. If you're in a county, you may be able to adopt the index, which lists all of the effective flood insurance rate maps in your county just in the index. We're working through that, so make sure to talk with us to make sure that it's okay to do that in your county. And then also adopt by the effective date. So you need to have the identification number for each of those panels or the index, and then the effective date. Section 3.0 is where you establish the floodplain as an overlay district. So it's explaining what exactly the usage of this floodplain is going to be in terms of regulations. It is establishing it as a zoning overlay district. So any development that falls under that overlay district established in section 3.0 applies to the floodplain ordinance. The ordinance will enact regulations that fall in that floodplain overlay district. Section 4, and I'm going to just by sections, and then again I'll open it up to see some detail. But this is where you establish the floodplain administrator position, the duties of the floodplain administrator, the permit application process for any floodplain development, variance and appeals procedures, and enforcement authority. So this is really establishing the administration of your floodplain management program just in one section. Really helps you lay out your administrative process, who's going to be in charge of enforcing the regulations, and then how appeals are handled. Actual standards and regulations for floodplain development can be found in section 5.0. This is general expectations for development in the floodplain, including alterations of the watercourse, encroachments, regulations in the floodway district, your elevation and floodproofing requirements for structures, including manufactured and mobile homes. It covers what to do with existing grandfathered structures. So if you have any buildings that were there before you adopted higher standards or before you had floodplain maps, this talks about what to do with those. And then design standards for development. So anchoring, drainage, the type of building materials to use, utility standards, storage of materials, etc. So all of this stuff is going to fall under section 5, your standards for floodplain development. Section 6 kind of expands on that existing structure concept, so it's talking about non-conforming structures. It establishes a discontinued use clause. So if your if this structure goes unused for a certain amount of time set by your community, then it nullifies that grandfather clause and it has to be brought into compliance with your ordinance. It also states that structures that are designated as nuisances may not continue nonconformance, and substantially damaged structures. So if you have a building in the floodplain that is substantially damaged by any means, flood, fire, tornado, whatever you may have, where the cost of that damage is 50% or more of the structure's market value, nullifies that grandfather clause and it has to be brought into compliance. So all of that is talked about in this section. And lastly, we have section 7 and 8. Section 7 talks about amendments, so that process of making amendments to the ordinance, and that it doesn't, just because you amend one section, does not nullify the rest of the ordinance. And your definitions. And I want to point out here, we'll talk about this in a moment, but any optional language that your community chooses to add or remove, make sure your definitions section matches up with that. So for example, if you decide to add language regarding appurtenant or accessory structures, you want to make sure that those get defined in section 8. Otherwise, you won't really have a means of enforcing that language if you're not able to define what an accessory structure is. So make sure that those match up, and I'll show you what that looks like. This optional language is, some of it is an actual higher standard than what Nebraska requires. Some of it is just recommended to improve the permitting capacity that your community has. And other language is prohibitory. So you're prohibiting a certain type of development from occurring in the floodplain. Or if you have a floodway, you can prohibit something in the floodway. So before we move on, I'm going to go ahead and let's open up the model ordinance and let's take a look at what it looks like. So hold on just a moment and I'm going to get that pulled up. Okay, is everybody seeing this? Okay, very good. Before I jump into it too far, I'll show you how I got here. This is our homepage, dnr.nebraska.gov, and I know Michelle sent you a link, so maybe this is a little redundant, but if you go under services, you'll find the digital desk reference under floodplain management. In the digital desk reference, this is what it will look like when you first open it. If you scroll down, you'll find a tab for legal authority and Nebraska model ordinances. And this is where we have them all listed. So 60.3A, B, C, and D. If you're not sure which one to pull, make sure to contact us, and we recommend that you do that anyway. Make sure that you aren't drafting an ordinance that isn't compliant, because that would take a lot of time, and it's better to start in the correct place than have to backtrack. So feel free to contact us. These are just here for your information. And this is what they look like. So again, I'm going to go through the 60.3D ordinance. This says August 2017. That's the last major revision that we did to the model ordinance, was back in 2017. We're gearing up for another major revision to have a much better model ordinance in the near future. So be on the lookout for that. It might be good to adopt a new model or a new ordinance using the newest model in the coming future. Don't worry, I will zoom in a little bit here so we can see things a little better. This front page is just establishing which ordinance you're using. There's an introductory note which talks about some of the optional language, how the ordinance works, some instructions for drafting. Feel free to read through this on your own time, but these first 2 pages aren't necessarily related to the ordinance itself. At the top, you'll have ordinance or resolution number. So depending on what your community is choosing to adopt, whether it be an ordinance or resolution, take the other one out. Make sure it's called what you want it to be called. And then the number. So assign it a number. Most of the time, communities will choose to use the year followed by the version or the number of the ordinance of that year. So if this is the 5th ordinance you've adopted in 2024, some communities will do 2024-5. This is again establishing a zoning overlay district, and it says it right here at the top as you're reading through it. And it explains exactly what it's introducing to the governing body. Again, sections 1 through 2.7 is going to establish those legal parameters for the ordinance, starting off with the statutory authorization. These statutes are up to date, and so you don't need to modify anything in here. Before I go any further, I will say that any language that you see here that is not highlighted is required language that has to be in here. Any language that you see in brackets has to be updated by you. So as you can see, we just have a placeholder for the governing body or the community name. You'll have to go through and edit those yourselves. Findings of fact. This is where we're talking about why the ordinance is necessary in the first place. It talks about the flood hazard areas of Nebraska are subject to inundation due to flooding that could impede or cause disruption to commerce and governmental services. Extraordinary public expenditures could cause impairment of the tax base, all of which adversely affect the public health, safety, and general welfare. The flood losses are caused by cumulative effect of obstructions in the floodplains. Causes increases in flood heights and velocities, and occupancy of flood hazard areas can be dangerous, essentially is what it's saying. Feel free to read through this. Statement of purpose, again, reiterating why this is important. So we're promoting public health, safety, and general welfare. And then it talks about which regulations it's adhering to. So it's adhering to Title 44 of the CFR, and the Title 455, Chapter 1. Section 2.1, lands to which the ordinance applies. Again, this is the important one for those of you receiving new flood insurance rate maps. You'll either adopt the panel numbers with a list and the effective date of those panel numbers. If you're a county, you may adopt the index followed by the effective date of that index. Again, make sure to work with us to make sure that that is okay and that works. But either way, this is where you're going to list your panels and their effective dates. And then it references section 3, talking about how it's establishing the zoning districts, and we'll get into that as we move through. Rules for interpretation. I won't go through every little piece of this ordinance. Feel free to read this on your own. But again, there's a place to identify your appeals board here. So make sure to pay attention to this paragraph. Compliance. This is talking about development needing to comply with the terms of the ordinance if it's in the floodplain. The ordinance doesn't repeal or impair any existing easements or deed restrictions. Where it imposes greater restrictions, this ordinance will prevail. Oops, I'm sorry. Interpretation of the regulations, of course. Your disclaimer of liability. So, of course, we're regulating to the 100 or 1% annual chance flood. Bigger floods might happen, and your community isn't necessarily going to be liable for those damages as long as you're enforcing this floodplain ordinance as it is deeming reasonable regulations for floodplain administration. And severability. So this allows certain portions of the ordinance to be deemed unconstitutional without affecting the remainder of the ordinance. So legal stuff done, fun stuff there. Establishment of zoning districts. This is where it establishes the floodplain as an overlay district, a zoning overlay for permitting purposes. You designate the floodplain administrator in section 4.1. We run into our first bit of optional language highlighted in blue here. This is language that can be removed or kept depending on your community's wishes. In this case, we are requiring the administrator of the floodplain to become a certified floodplain manager within 1 year of being designated. And of course, this can be adjusted to your liking. It's optional language after all. Floodplain development permits are required in the floodplain. Simple enough. 4.3, duties of the floodplain administrator. These are all in white, so again, these are all required. You have to keep these in here. So these responsibilities of the floodplain administrator all have to be here. If you're interested in adding more, feel free to let us know. Permit application and demonstration of compliance. So this talks about the administrative process for receiving a permit in your office to completion of the project. So it talks about what the applicant needs to file to you in order to start development. If the proposed development is located in the floodplain or partially in the floodplain, they have to provide you with the information before you give them a permit. And it talks about what needs to be considered in that permit application. New and substantially improved structures. This is talking about an elevation certificate. So once they are done completing a structure, part of building a structure, you have to elevate or flood-proof that structure to 1 foot above the base flood elevation, for those of you that are familiar with Nebraska's minimum standards for floodplain management. Well, how do you make sure they did that once you've given them a permit? It's built into your administrative procedures here in the model ordinance that they have to provide you with an elevation certificate or proof of compliance that they followed your permit, and it builds it into your administrative procedures in your ordinance. If they choose to floodproof, a floodproofing certificate has to be provided to you. If they're in the floodway, they have to show no rise in floodwaters deemed by a licensed professional engineer. And we give you this: any other such information as reasonably may be required by the floodplain administrator shall be provided. That gives you some good power to ask for more information if you don't feel like they're giving you enough. Letters of map revision, I won't get into this a whole lot. We have a letter of map revision or a letter of map change class. What this does is it establishes procedures if you ever receive a letter of map revision based on fill or letter of map revision. The community is required to sign off on a community acknowledgement form. This paragraph establishes your procedures for signing off on such form. We always recommend you include this unless you are prohibiting the use of fill in the floodplain. Flood data required. This talks about the flood insurance study, and until a floodway is designated, so if you're in an A zone without a floodway, development cannot cause an increase in water surface elevation of more than 1 foot in any location. So this is talking about the less than 1 foot rise determinations. Variances and appeals procedures, feel free to read through these, but I get a lot of questions of how do we give a variance? Well, if you use the model ordinance, it lays out all of your procedures and requirements in terms of the NFIP for granting a variance. We'll go through here. I'll get to that in a moment. Enforcement, this is where you'll find your regulations if you find a violation in your floodplain. Failure to obtain a floodplain permit or failure of a structure to be compliant with the ordinance constitutes a violation, and it gives you your responsibilities, your regulations, and your penalties for enforcing your floodplain ordinance. Section 5, you have your standards for floodplain development. I'll move through relatively quick here. I see that we're at 1 o'clock, so I'll move through here. Your floodway overlay district is established here if you have a D ordinance, if your community has a floodway. Some more optional language. We have a 1 foot requirement for any structures built in the floodplain. They have to be elevated, or if non-residential, they have to be flood-proofed to at least 1 foot above the base flood elevation. You can increase that number to 2 feet or 3 feet or 4 feet, whatever you feel works best for your community. You can also remove language related to dry floodproofing, which makes elevation the only method to achieve compliance. We have new language for agricultural structures and accessory buildings in the floodplain. So for those of you that have more than just residential or non-residential designations, you might be interested in this language. We have a class on agricultural and accessory structures that I recommend you watch. Critical facilities, for those of you that have nursing homes or hospitals or fire departments in the floodplain, or that might be interested in building in the floodplain, you can adopt this language to give a little bit more authority to help regulate that type of development up to even the 500-year floodplain. Moving through, we have spaces below lowest floor. I won't get into all of those regulations, but this is talking about crawl spaces, not basements, or above grade garages that a building is built on top of. Again, accessory buildings, I recommend you watch that class on your own time. We have regulations for manufactured homes, and you can choose to prohibit them if you so choose. Your existing structure language is here, talking about the buildings that were there prior to your regulations being adopted or being in the floodplain. And your general construction standards. You can prohibit fill being used in the floodplain here, but it has your regulations for anchoring, utilities, drainage, storage of materials, and such. You can prohibit recreational vehicles in the floodplain or floodway. This is where you'll find your recreational vehicle language. Again, anything in white is required. Subdivision language, non-conforming use language, amendments, and definitions. And again, anything, so if you do decide to adopt accessory structure language, make sure you adopt the optional language as well. This is our contact information. If you have any questions that you couldn't quite think of in time, if you think of some later, feel free to reach out to us. Again, I want to reiterate how important the ordinance is in your community. It's kind of hard to have an effective floodplain administrative program if your ordinance isn't up to date. So we really recommend that you read through your floodplain ordinance. It is the backbone of your floodplain program. Any community that's in the National Flood Insurance Program has a floodplain ordinance. So I strongly recommend that you review it. And if you have any concerns about the language that's included in it, feel free to reach out to us. This is one of the biggest things that we do, is we help communities update their floodplain ordinances. Is the village board chairman the same as a mayor? Not quite. So the village board chairman, that's going to be for your villages, and then your cities will have a mayor. If you have a different structure, let us know. That may not always apply, I'm sure. But to my understanding, a city will have a mayor. The mayor, of course, is the one who can veto ordinances. If you remember, they can veto ordinances, and then it goes back to the city council to decide on whether they're going to pass it or not. A village board chairman doesn't necessarily have that veto power. Yes, yeah. We are going to go through that process in the next year, Melissa. So we are going to update our model ordinance. We've received a lot of suggestions, and we've looked at some other state model ordinances, and we've seen a lot of places that we can really improve our current model. So as we go through that process, part of that will be setting up a committee, and some of you may be involved in that committee, so we can get some local input as we go through that process. But as we go through that process, and once we reach completion, everybody will be notified that that model ordinance is now available, and you can choose to update your ordinance to that newest model. But yes, we'll make sure we won't do that just under your noses. We will make sure everybody's involved and everybody's communicated with as we go through. Yes. What about, thanks, Melissa, you too. Yeah, have a great day. What if we still have paper floodplain maps? What will that change the ordinance compared to those who are on the interactive page? So, okay, yeah, so paper maps are still delineated by flood insurance rate map panels. It used to be way back in the day that they were called flood hazard boundary maps. Those were either rescinded or changed to flood insurance rate maps. So as far as I'm aware, even paper maps are still going to use that panel identification process. They might be a little shorter than some of the newer panels that are being produced today, but those will still have an identification number very similar to those that have digital maps. They're just identified by a panel identification number. If you're interested, so the interactive map does have a way of viewing your paper maps. We have put them in a sort of digital format. They just kind of overlay on top of your imagery. If you're interested, we might be able to show you how to do that. So this is FEMA's Map Service Center, msc.fema.gov. If you just type in FEMA MSC and do Google, you can pull this up. This is the welcome page. If you want to look at your specific community, you can click on Search All Products here. and then you can use this drop down to get to your community. And Clearwater, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And this will pull up your effective products. You have your historic ones. So these historic ones are likely going to be your flood hazard boundary maps. So you'll know that it is a flood hazard boundary map because it will say so. Oof, sorry. There we go. So this one says flood hazard boundary map. This is a historic map. We no longer use flood hazard boundary maps. Let's close that. Let's look at the effective products. So if you drop down this folder, you'll find that you have, looks like, I believe this one is the index, this first one, so you don't need this one. You have one flood insurance rate map called 31026-20001B. And this is where you can find that current firm panel here. And download it. So it looks like it finds floodplain up in your top left, zone A. This would establish you as a B level ordinance, if you're interested.
And if you're using the NeDNR interactive map, one of the layers across the top is, thank you, Elijah.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, if you're using the interactive map, if you go zoom into Clearwater, so I'll just type it in at the top here. I'm gonna go a little closer, Okay. So these the maps that show up at first, this is your flood awareness area. This is what your floodplain maps could look like in the future, but they're not currently effective because you have paper maps. So if you click on this icon with the 3 squares stacked on top of each other, if it doesn't show up for you, click this More tab and it might show up in here. But open up the layers and you'll find this effective paper map button. If you just turn that on, and I'll turn off the flood awareness areas, but now you can see your floodplain and your jurisdiction in a paper format. So yes, you do have this available. A little bit difficult sometimes to kind of zoom in and see where the exact line is. That's why you have interpretation language in your floodplain ordinance that we showed earlier.